There are words that break you inside in ways you never thought possible. Words that come from the person who is supposed to always protect you, from the one who gave you life, from the one who taught you to walk and to say your first words. And when those words come out of their mouth, when they look you directly in the eyes and tell you that there is no longer any space for you in their life, something inside you shatters in a way that no therapy, no amount of time, no hug can completely repair. This is the story of how my father threw me out of his house after I supported him for an entire year, after I sacrificed absolutely everything for him, after I let go of my own life to sustain his when no one else was there. And the worst part of all, what truly destroys me every time I think about it, is that when I finally understood why he did it, when I discovered the truth that was hiding behind his cold words, it was already too late for so many things that can never be recovered. My name is Carolina. I am 37 years old, and until a little over 2 years ago, I thought I had my life more or less on track, that I had managed to build something solid despite all the adversities. It wasn't perfect, because no one has a perfect life no matter how hard they try, but I had a stable job as a human resources manager in a medium-sized tech sector company, a one-bedroom apartment I was slowly paying off with my mortgage, a few friends I would go out with on weekends for coffee or to the movies, and that naive illusion that someday I would meet someone special and form the family I had always dreamed of having. I didn't ask for much from life, just the basic things we all want and deserve: financial security, emotional tranquility, a little happiness amid the daily chaos. But life, that cruel teacher that teaches us the hardest lessons when we are least prepared, has a brutal way of taking everything from you in an instant, of making you believe you have control over your destiny, and then showing you with an almost sadistic cruelty that you never really did. Everything began to crumble on a Tuesday afternoon in March, one of those gray days where the sky seems to foretell misfortune. I remember perfectly it was a Tuesday because we always had team meetings on Tuesdays at 3 in the afternoon, a weekly ritual we had been doing for years, and that day the meeting was completely different from all the previous ones. We were all summoned to the main conference room, something very unusual because we normally met in the general manager's office, which was smaller and more informal. When we entered the room, we saw tense and serious faces everywhere, papers meticulously organized on the shiny mahogany table, and that heavy, dense silence that announces bad news, the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. The company was going through a severe financial crisis, they told us in studiedly neutral voices. They needed to make immediate and significant staff cuts to stay afloat. And I, along with 17 other employees whose names they read from a list with an administrative coldness that froze my blood, was on the list of mass layoffs. 22 years of my life working at that damned company. 22 years of getting up early, staying late when necessary, sacrificing vacations and weekends, giving my energy and creativity to a place that fired me with a cold, generic corporate letter, a severance package that would barely cover 3 months of my basic expenses, and an awkward handshake from a manager whose voice trembled as he thanked me for my services, but who did absolutely nothing to defend me or fight for my position. I left that office carrying a cardboard box containing all my belongings from the desk that had been my second home for over 2 decades. A framed photo of my mother who died when I was just 15 from a sudden aneurysm, a succulent plant that never bloomed, but which I stubbornly insisted on keeping alive, because I felt it was my responsibility. A wall calendar where I had marked all the important dates of the work year in different colors, and a mug that said, "The best boss in the world," that my employees had given me 3 years prior. Dates and objects that now meant absolutely nothing. The first days after the layoff, I spent completely submerged in a deep and painful denial. I woke up early as I had always done for decades, showered with cold water to wake up, made coffee in my old coffee maker that made a strange noise but had never given me trouble, dressed in my office clothes, even though I had nowhere to go, and obsessively checked my email every 10 minutes, hoping it had all been a terrible mistake, that they would call me saying please come back, that they needed me, that they had made an unforgivable mistake. But the call never came, the email never came, no one really missed me. Then came the rage, that blind, destructive rage that consumes you from the inside like an uncontrollable fire and makes you want to scream until you lose your voice, break things regardless of their value, blame everyone else for your situation, because it's easier than accepting that sometimes life is simply unfair and cruel for no particular reason. I broke plates, kicked furniture, cried until my ribs hurt, and my eyes swelled. Then came the sadness, that deep, visceral sadness that weighs on your chest like a huge stone and doesn't let you breathe properly, that makes you cry for no apparent reason, in the middle of the supermarket, when you see someone in an office uniform, or while watching stupid, sentimental commercials on television about happy families you never had. I started looking for a job immediately, with a desperation that grew each day. I updated my resume every morning with small changes I thought might make a difference, sent applications to literally dozens of companies every week, went to interviews where they smiled at me with that professional, fake smile and told me, "We'll call you soon to inform you of our decision." But the call never came, the email never came, the rejection was constant and silent. The fundamental problem was my age. I knew it from the start even though no one said it explicitly. 37 years old in a job market that desperately seeks youth, freshness, renewable energy, people willing to work for miserable salaries and exhausting hours without complaining. I had proven experience of over 2 decades. Of course I did. Excellent references from previous bosses, measurable achievements in my career, but experience has become a heavy, unwanted burden when companies can easily hire someone freshly graduated, 25 years old with a shiny university degree, and no expectations of high salaries or specific work conditions. The months passed with agonizing slowness, and my financial situation worsened rapidly and terrifyingly. The severance pay I had received ran out much faster than I had calculated in my most pessimistic projections. The monthly apartment rent literally ate up half of what I had left. Utilities like electricity, water, and gas consumed another considerable part. The food I tried to make as economical as possible, but which still cost money, public transportation to get to job interviews, phone and internet bills I needed to keep looking for work, credit card debts I had accumulated in better times. Everything added up in an overwhelming and apocalyptic way. I started falling behind on payments more and more frequently, receiving threatening collection letters with intimidating legal language, systematically ignoring calls from unknown numbers because I knew perfectly well they were from the bank or some aggressive collection agency. My landlady, a 70-year-old woman who had always been understanding and kind to me during the 5 years I had lived there, started knocking on my door more frequently each week, with that uncomfortable look that mixes genuine pity and legitimate financial concern, asking me in a soft but firm voice when exactly I could pay her the 3 months I already owed her. It was precisely at that moment of total and absolute desperation, when I felt I was drowning in a sea of debt and saw no possible way out, that I finally mustered enough courage to call my father and ask for help. We hadn't talked much in the recent years of my adult life, to tell the truth. We only maintained occasional and superficial calls on birthdays, Christmas, and some important holiday, incredibly brief and empty conversations where we caught up in exactly 5 minutes about our lives, and then were left with absolutely nothing substantial to say to each other, listening to the awkward silence on the other end of the line. Our relationship had always been distant and cold, even when I was a small child who desperately sought his attention and approval. He worked absolutely all the time at his factory. He was an extremely emotionally tough man, of very few words and affectionate expressions, who genuinely believed that providing financially for his family was a sufficient and complete demonstration of paternal love. After my mother died suddenly when I was just 15, that emotional distance that already existed became infinitely greater and insurmountable, as if without her in the middle, there was absolutely nothing that truly connected us as father and daughter. My father lived completely alone in the house where I had grown up throughout my childhood and adolescence, a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of the city, with a front garden that my mother used to care for with obsessive dedication and true love, and which was now a complete mess of wildly overgrown weeds, dead, dried flowers, and grass that no one had mowed in months. When I finally explained my entire desperate situation to him over the phone, swallowing what little pride I had left, and admitting my complete failure, there was a terribly long and awkward silence on the other end of the line that made me think he might have hung up. Then I heard his voice, rough and raspy as I had always known it, telling me in a neutral tone that I could stay with him for a reasonable time, until I got a stable job again, until I could recover financially and move forward. He didn't sound particularly happy or excited about the idea of his adult daughter coming back to live with him. That was absolutely clear from his tone. but he didn't directly reject me either, and honestly at that point in my life, that was completely enough for me. I needed a roof over my head, and I had absolutely no other viable option. I packed all my belongings in old suitcases and cardboard boxes I got from the neighborhood supermarket, left my apartment with a contradictory mixture of relief at not having to pay that impossible rent anymore, in deep shame at having to admit to my landlady that I would never be able to pay her what I owed, and moved back to my childhood home like a complete 37-year-old failure. The house looked significantly older and more run-down, sadder and more neglected than my memories held. The exterior paint on the walls was peeling and falling off in large pieces. There were obvious leaks in the roof that my father had clearly never bothered to repair properly. The gutters were clogged with dead leaves, and a persistent smell of accumulated damp and human solitude permeated every room of that house. My old teenage room was exactly as I had left it the day I moved out at 19 to start my independent life, with the same faded posters of bands I didn't even listen to anymore on the walls, the same ugly floral bedspread on the single bed, the same books on the shelf. It was as if my father had deliberately turned that space into a kind of frozen sanctuary of a time that would never return, a personal museum of a version of me that no longer existed. The first days of living together were extraordinarily strange and uncomfortable for both of us. We had no idea how to behave with each other in a shared space after so many years of distance. We were basically two complete strangers who shared DNA and a roof, awkwardly trying to establish basic living routines, carefully avoiding deep or personal conversations that could lead us into dangerous emotional territory. I remained locked in my room, obsessively looking for work from my old laptop, sending hundreds of resumes to companies that probably didn't even read them, going to frustrating interviews that inevitably led nowhere concrete. My father left very early in the mornings before I got up, for his job as a line supervisor at a large auto parts factory, a job he had faithfully maintained for over 30 long years of his life, and returned extremely late at night, completely exhausted and drained, with that kind of tiredness that is clearly not just physical but deep in the soul and spirit. But then, exactly 1 month and 3 days after I moved in with him, counting each day on my mental calendar, my father came home significantly earlier than normal on a Friday afternoon. He came heavily through the front door with his shoulders completely slumped in defeat, his face terribly gray and gaunt, and I knew immediately in my stomach that something really bad had happened. He sat down slowly on the old, sunken sofa in the living room, took off his work shoes with slow, tired movements, and looked directly at me with those eyes that in my entire life had never known how to express complex emotions, but which were now completely full of something that seemed like pure existential terror. He had been fired without warning. The factory where he had worked his entire adult life was definitively closing all its local operations, moving entirely to another Latin American country where labor was significantly cheaper and benefits practically non-existent. 32 complete years of his life, faithfully given to that place that exploited him, and they fired him coldly with an absolutely mediocre severance that would barely cover 4 or 5 months of basic expenses, and an impersonal, generic thank you letter, digitally signed by someone from Human Resources, who probably had never met him personally. He was 63 years old, recently turned, an age that in the current job market is practically impossible for finding another similar job with a decent salary, with no significant savings because honestly, he had always lived completely hand-to-mouth, spending everything he earned on paying bills and surviving, naively trusting that this stable employment would last until his official retirement at 65. That night we got drunk together for the first and only time in our entire shared life. My father took out a bottle of cheap whiskey from a dusty closet that he had saved from who knows when for special occasions that frankly never came, and we sat in silence in the poorly lit kitchen drinking directly from mismatched old glasses, without ice because there was none, without meaningful conversation at first, just the repetitive sound of the amber liquid being clumsily poured and swallowed with grimaces of distaste. Then, with the alcohol beginning to soften and knock down the giant emotional barriers that had always existed between us like an impenetrable wall, we finally started to talk for real, to open our hearts in a way we had never done before. He told me in a broken voice about his paralyzing fear of old age and poverty, about how he felt completely useless as a man, old and finished, absolutely disposable for a society that only values youth and economic productivity. I told him about my own growing desperation, about the endless nights I stayed awake wondering if I would ever have anything resembling a normal, dignified life again, if I would ever stop feeling like a complete and absolute human failure. It was strange and beautiful simultaneously, that unique moment of genuinely shared vulnerability. For the first time in literally decades of living as strangers under the same last name, my father and I saw each other as complete and complex human beings, with deep fears and real pains, not just as family roles we were obliged to fulfill by biology. That memorable night we made a completely silent but deeply meaningful pact. We were going to survive this terrible crisis together, to care for each other as we never had before, to be the real support we both desperately needed at that absolutely terrible moment in our broken lives. And so officially began our full year living together, both completely without stable work, both struggling desperately to stay financially afloat in a system that had clearly abandoned us. I had some modest savings I had managed to carefully save before the layoff in a separate account. It wasn't really much money, but it was enough to help significantly with the basic household expenses for a few months. My father finally received his severance pay after weeks of frustrating bureaucratic procedures, and between the two of us, we had exactly just enough to pay the most basic and essential bills, buy economical but nutritious food, keep the light and water services minimally functioning. We established together an extremely strict routine of controlled spending. We bought exclusively the absolute essentials at the cheapest supermarket we could find. We cooked absolutely everything at home without allowing ourselves any luxuries. We immediately canceled all services, not strictly necessary, like cable, streaming, and various subscriptions. We spent literally every day tirelessly looking for work, both constantly facing brutal and systematic rejection, the cruel and ruthless indifference of the modern working world that has absolutely no mercy for the unemployed, over 35. My father, who his whole life had been a tremendously proud man of his work and his ability to provide, started applying with growing desperation to jobs he would never have even considered before this crisis. Night security guard in lonely buildings, city bus driver on dangerous routes, bagger in supermarkets where he would have to stand for 8 hours straight, food delivery person on a bicycle. But absolutely no one wanted to hire a man of his advanced age, especially for such physically demanding and strenuous jobs that required endurance he honestly no longer had. For my part, I desperately expanded my search to literally anything that paid even a miserable minimum wage, from administrative assistant in small offices to retail salesperson in clothing stores. But ironically, my extensive experience made me appear overqualified for some basic positions and not appropriate, or too old for others that specifically sought young, inexperienced people. With the slow and inexorable passage of time, something profound and meaningful began gradually to change in our father-daughter relationship that had been broken for decades. The daily coexistence forced by circumstances, the shared economic struggle against a common invisible enemy, was slowly tearing down the giant emotional walls we had carefully built over so many years of distance and silence. We started cooking together in the afternoons, discovering that we both enjoyed experimenting with cheap but tasty recipes, to watch old movies at night on the ancient television in the living room, to finally tell each other real and honest stories from our lives that we had never shared with the other before. My father spoke to me extensively about his own extremely difficult and traumatic childhood, about a severely alcoholic father who brutally beat him for no reason, about a depressive mother who simply left one morning when he was just 10 years old and never returned or wrote. He told me in detail about how he met my mother at a town dance when they were both 20 years old, about their beautiful time as young, hopeful lovers, about the big, ambitious dreams they had together of having a happy, prosperous family, in which the hard reality of life cruelly erased little by little, until only routine and tiredness remained. I also spoke to him with total honesty about my own lonely childhood, about how I really felt devastated when Mom died so suddenly and he just completely closed off emotionally, about the deep, penetrating loneliness I experienced growing up in that house where he was always physically present but never really emotionally available. I told him in detail about my multiple failed and painful romantic relationships, about the man who promised me eternal marriage and then cowardly left with my supposed best friend, about the traumatic abortion I had completely alone at 25, and which I had never told anyone about because I carried too much shame, about all the broken, bleeding pieces of my life that I had been carrying completely alone for so long without any real support. We cried together many, many times during that transformative year, We cried painfully for everything we had, irreversibly lost, for the precious time we stupidly wasted in silence and emotional distance, for the innumerable opportunities we never consciously took to be a truly united and loving family. But we also genuinely laughed, found unexpected humor in our absurd and ridiculous situation, in the complete absurdity of a life that takes away absolutely everything material only to give you something completely unexpected and genuinely precious. True human connection, deep, mutual understanding, liberating forgiveness. My personal savings were completely exhausted after exactly 4.5 months of stretching them to the maximum. My father's severance pay lasted a little longer because it was larger, but by the 8th full month of our coexistence, we were in a truly desperate and terrifying situation. We started systematically selling valuable things from the house, antique furniture that had some value in the second-hand market, old but functional appliances we didn't really use, the few gold jewels my mother had left, and which my father had jealously kept all these years in a shoebox in his closet. Every time we sold something with sentimental value, we both felt deeply that we were selling literally irreplaceable pieces of our lives, of our most precious shared memories, but honestly we had absolutely no other viable option if we wanted to keep eating and the lights on. I eventually got some extremely poorly paid temporary jobs, things that paid miserable wages and lasted only a few weeks before ending abruptly, handing out advertising flyers on the street, standing for hours under the scorching summer sun that burned my skin, doing tedious telephone surveys from a noisy, claustrophobic call center, where they treated you literally like a disposable number and yelled at you if you didn't meet impossible quotas, thoroughly cleaning huge houses of extremely rich people who looked at you with barely concealed disdain and spoke to you as if you were completely invisible or inferior. My father also occasionally found some temporary and physically demanding jobs, helping with moves, carrying heavy furniture that destroyed his back, doing minor plumbing and electrical repairs for neighbors who paid him almost nothing, working on construction sites where his 63-year-old deteriorated body suffered terribly, but he never complained out loud because we desperately needed that money. The scarce money we both earned with so much effort barely covered the basics. There were entire weeks when we literally ate only boiled white rice and black beans because there was no money for anything else. When we had to painfully choose between paying the electricity bill or buying enough food. When we sat together in total darkness because we hadn't been able to pay the electric service that month, and talked by the trembling light of cheap supermarket candles, pretending to each other that it was something romantic and different, that it was a little adventure, when the brutal reality was that it was profoundly humiliating and painful to be living like this at our ages. But despite all the constant material suffering and the crushing economic stress, there was something genuinely beautiful and transformative happening between us that neither of us could deny. My father and I had gradually become true life companions, a solid and unbreakable team that faced the terrible adversity together with dignity. He protected me emotionally when he could, constantly encouraged me when I just wanted to give up and disappear, told me with conviction that I was strong and capable, that I was valuable as a person, that this whole horrible situation was absolutely temporary. I took care of him with dedication, meticulously made sure he ate well, and enough even when I myself went hungry, so the food would stretch, helped him with massages when his aching back hurt unbearably after heavy physical jobs, constantly reminded him that he was very much worth it as a human being, that he was a good man despite his past mistakes, that I genuinely loved him. Never in our entire lives had we been so profoundly close and connected. Never had we said "I love you" to each other with such genuine frequency and real sincerity. For the first time in my entire life, I felt that I really had a true father, not just a biological man who had given me his last name and a roof over my head, but someone who really knew me deeply, who understood me in my complexities, who was present both emotionally and physically. And he repeatedly told me with tears in his eyes that I had literally saved him from death, that without my presence and support he would have simply let himself die of overwhelming sadness and hopelessness, that I had given him a powerful and meaningful reason to keep fighting every day. I honestly thought with all my heart that we had finally reached a solid place from which we could only move forward positively together, that absolutely nothing and no one could separate us after absolutely everything we had overcome united. I was completely wrong and had no idea. When exactly 1 full calendar year had passed since we started living together under the same roof, exactly 1 year since I desperately moved into his house, A full year since we both simultaneously lost our stable jobs. My father came home one ordinary Thursday afternoon with a strange facial expression I couldn't correctly decipher. It wasn't pure happiness, nor was it obvious sadness exactly. It was something tremendously complicated and mixed in between. He asked me in a serious voice to sit on the sofa, that he urgently needed to talk to me about something important. My heart immediately started beating rapidly. I thought of 1,000 terrifying possibilities. Maybe he had finally gotten a stable job, or that we had to inevitably sell the family home, or that he was seriously ill and hadn't told me before. I literally never in my wildest imagination imagined what he was actually going to tell me in the following minutes. He had casually met a woman at one of his recent temporary jobs. He told me in an oddly neutral voice, a 60-year-old widow named Beatrice, who was also going through tremendous similar economic difficulties, who was also completely alone in the world. They had started talking during work breaks, getting to know each other gradually, and had developed what he called a special connection. She had her own house, smaller than ours but with no pending mortgage, completely paid off, and she had concretely proposed that they move in together, combine their limited economic resources, help each other survive. I listened to his careful words with a growing feeling of complete unreality, as if I were living a surreal nightmare. Was he seriously telling me he had met someone romantic, that he was going to leave the house, and specifically what happened to me in this whole plan? Then finally came the specific words that completely shattered me inside. "Pack your bags, daughter." He told me in a voice trying to sound firm that Beatrice's house was small, that it only had 2 modest rooms, that there simply wasn't enough physical space for 3 adults. He told me that he needed to think seriously about his own future and stability, about his rapidly approaching old age, that he couldn't keep living indefinitely in this constant economic uncertainty. He told me that I was still relatively young and capable, that I would eventually find my own path in life, that this separation was genuinely better for both of us in the long term. I simply couldn't believe what I was hearing coming out of his mouth. After absolutely everything we had intensely lived through together during that transformative year, after everything I had specifically done sacrificially for him, after having literally sacrificed my last savings to support him financially, after having sold even my mother's precious jewels to pay the bills of that damned house, was he throwing me out? Was he literally leaving me on the street for a woman he had just met a few weeks ago? I screamed at him with all the strength of my lungs, cried inconsolably, confronted him with harsh words for every single thing I had done for him. I reminded him in great detail that I had been there unconditionally when he needed me most, that I had completely put my own life on hold to take care of him, that I had given him absolutely everything I had without asking for anything in return. He simply remained completely silent and motionless, staring fixedly at the wooden floor, his hands deep in his pants pockets, with that characteristic expression of guilt that nonetheless did nothing to change his final decision. He told me he had thought about this a lot for weeks, that he knew perfectly well he was hurting me deeply, but that he needed to do what was objectively best for him at this point in his life. He told me he had deposited money into my bank account, exactly $5,000 he had gotten from I don't know where exactly, that would help me significantly to start my life over. As if cold money could compensate for the monumental betrayal, as if $5 miserable thousand were enough to magically erase the heart-wrenching pain of being cruelly abandoned by my own father. I asked him in a trembling voice about Beatrice, about this mysterious woman who had conveniently appeared out of nowhere and offered him a comfortable, easy way out of his responsibility towards me. He told me softly that she was a good person, that I would probably like her if I gave her a chance, that maybe someday in the future we could meet cordially. The absolutely pure rage I felt at that precise moment was so intense and overwhelming that I seriously thought I was going to faint. Meet her? Why in the world would I want to meet the woman for whom my father was mercilessly throwing me out of his life? During the next 3 absolutely horrible days, we almost didn't speak to each other directly. I packed my things slowly and painfully, with deep resentment, with constant tears I couldn't control, with a sense of betrayal so profound and visceral that it physically hurt in my chest. I watched my father move mechanically through the house, systematically preparing his own things, making detailed plans for his new comfortable life with Beatrice, and I honestly couldn't recognize him at all. Where was the man who had hugged me tightly when I cried inconsolably? Where was the father who constantly told me we were an unbreakable team? How exactly could he have changed so completely in such a short time? The day I finally left that house, a rainy gray Sunday that seemed taken from a cheap dramatic movie, my father tried to hug me at the door. I pulled away sharply. I couldn't stand his touch. I couldn't pretend for a second that I was okay with this, that I rationally understood it, that I forgave him. He told me in a broken voice that he loved me, that I would always be his daughter no matter what, that he would call me regularly. I didn't respond at all. I simply loaded my suitcases heavily into the taxi I had called, and left without looking back even once. I literally had nowhere to go. With the $5,000 my father gave me, I desperately looked for a room in a shared house, a claustrophobic, small space with an uncomfortable single bed, a tiny closet, and a bathroom I had to share with 3 other noisy tenants. It was profoundly depressing, but it was exactly what I could afford while I looked for a job again. The following months were a kind of endless hell. I finally got a part-time job at a hipster coffee shop, serving ridiculously expensive coffees to people who didn't really see me as a person, who treated me like part of the decorative furniture. The pay was barely enough for my room and basic food. I obsessively looked for other, better jobs, but the full year of unemployment on my resume was a black mark that no one could ignore. My father called me occasionally. I systematically ignored his calls at first, but eventually answered once. He told me about his life with Beatrice, about how they were doing well, about how he had found a part-time job at a hardware store. He sounded happy, or at least relieved, and that hurt me more than anything else. How could he be happy when I was suffering so much? How could he move on so easily after shattering me like that? I told him I didn't want to know more about his life, to leave me alone, and I hung up. I didn't answer his calls after that. 6 months passed. I was still at the coffee shop, still in my depressing room, still trapped in a life that seemed to have no way out. I had lost weight, had permanent dark circles under my eyes, had developed an anxiety that woke me up at night with a racing heart and trembling hands. Some nights I considered simply giving up, disappearing, ending the pain once and for all, but something in me, some stubborn piece of survival, kept me getting up every morning, putting on that coffee shop uniform, pretending I was okay. It was on one of those gray, hopeless days that I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me respond. It was Beatrice. Her voice was soft, polite, with a tone that mixed urgency and nervousness. She apologized for calling me, told me she had gotten my number from my father's phone. She told me she needed to see me, that it was important, that please give her the opportunity to talk to me. Something in her tone made me accept. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe I was just so tired of being angry that I wanted to see what this woman who had changed my life so drastically had to say. We met at a cafe, not the coffee shop where I worked, but another neutral place. When I saw her enter, I was surprised. She was a small, thin woman, with short gray hair and sad eyes. She didn't seem like the villain I had built in my mind. She didn't seem like a seductress who had stolen my father. She seemed tired, scared, and terribly uncomfortable. She sat down in front of me, and before I could say anything, she started talking. She apologized, told me it was never her intention to cause me pain, that she didn't know the full situation when she met my father. She told me her own story. She had lost her husband 3 years prior to cancer, had spent all her savings on treatments that didn't work, had had to sell her big house, and buy something smaller to survive. She was alone, scared, desperate to have someone in her life again. When she met my father at that temporary job, she saw in him someone who understood pain, loss, struggle. She didn't know he had a daughter living with him. She told me, my father had never spoken to her about me until they started making plans to live together, and when he finally did, he presented it as something temporary, as if I were just a tenant rather than his daughter. I listened to her story without interrupting, feeling my perception of the situation begin to change, to become complicated. This woman wasn't my enemy. She was another broken person trying to survive in a cruel world. Then Beatrice told me something that made my world stop. My father was sick. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer 4 months ago, shortly after moving in with her. It was advanced, aggressive, and the doctors had given him between 6 months and a year to live. He had started chemotherapy, but it wasn't working well. He was weak, losing weight quickly, and according to the doctors, time was running out. I couldn't process what I was hearing. My father was dying and no one had told me. Why hadn't he told me? Beatrice explained that he had made her promise not to contact me, not to tell me anything, to let me continue with my life without the burden of his illness. But she couldn't stay silent. She told me. It wasn't fair to me. It wasn't fair that I didn't have the opportunity to decide whether or not I wanted to be there for him in his final moments. She handed me a piece of paper with an address, the address of the house where they lived. She told me my father would be there that afternoon, that Beatrice had to go out for a few hours for some errands, that if I wanted to see him, that would be a good time. She begged me to think about it, not to let pride or pain prevent me from doing what my heart told me. After she left, I stayed sitting in that cafe for hours, looking at the paper with the address, trying to understand my emotions. I was furious with my father for hiding his illness from me, for throwing me out instead of trusting me with the truth. But I was also terrified of losing him, of him dying without us being able to fix things, without me being able to tell him so many things I needed to say. Finally, I took a bus to the address Beatrice had given me. The house was small but well kept, with a front garden full of flowers, very different from the neglected house where I grew up. I knocked on the door with trembling hands, not knowing what to expect. My father opened the door and the shock on his face was immediate. He looked terrible. He had lost so much weight that his clothes hung loosely on him. His skin had a grayish tone, and there was a fragility in him that I had never seen before. For a moment we just looked at each other, neither of us knowing what to say. Then he started to cry, not silent tears but deep sobs that shook his fragile body. He asked me to come in, please come in, that he needed to talk to me. I followed him inside, and we sat on a small sofa in the living room. And there in that strange house that was supposed to be his new beginning, my father told me the truth. He had discovered he had cancer 2 weeks before asking me to pack my bags. The doctors had told him it was terminal, that treatment would be hard and probably useless. At that moment he told me he could only think of one thing. He didn't want me to have to take care of him during his death. He didn't want me to sacrifice more years of my life cleaning his vomit, changing his sheets, watching him slowly deteriorate until he was nothing more than a shell of the man he was. He met Beatrice at that moment of panic and desperation. She offered him not only a place to live, but someone who could take care of him, someone who had already been through this with her husband, someone who understood the process of death and was willing to accompany him. He didn't throw me out because he didn't love me, he told me. He threw me out because he loved me too much, because he wanted me to have a chance to live my life without the weight of his death. He told me he gave me that money hoping it would be enough for me to start over, that I could get a place to live, that I could concentrate on finding a job and rebuilding my life. He didn't tell me about his illness because he knew that if he did, I would stay. I would insist on taking care of him, and he couldn't allow me to do that. I listened to all this with tears running down my face, feeling a mixture of emotions so intense I thought I would break in two. I was furious with him for making that decision without me, for assuming he knew what was best for me, for taking away the option of being there for him. But I also understood, in a painful and complicated way, why he had done it. He had been selfish trying to be selfless. He had been cruel trying to be kind. I told him he was an idiot, that he had hurt me in a way I didn't know if I could ever completely forgive. I told him he had no right to make decisions about my life without consulting me, that I was an adult capable of deciding how I wanted to spend my time and with whom I wanted to be. I told him I had spent the last 6 months hating him, feeling betrayed, questioning everything we had built during that year together. But I also told him that I loved him, that I would always love him, that he was my father and nothing he had done could change that. I told him I wanted to be there for him, that I needed to be there for him, that no matter how difficult it was, how painful, I needed to accompany him on this last leg of his life. My father hugged me and we cried together for what seemed like hours. When Beatrice returned, she found us still sitting together on the sofa, emotionally exhausted but at peace in some way. She looked at me with gratitude, with relief, and in that moment I knew this woman truly cared for my father, that she wasn't a villain but another lost soul who had found some comfort in the company of someone else. During the next 6 months, I spent every free moment I had with my father. I kept working at the coffee shop because I needed the money, but every afternoon after work, every weekend, I went to that small house where my father was fighting a disease we knew would win. I accompanied him to his chemotherapy sessions, held his hand while he vomited from the side effects of the medications, read books to him when he was too weak to hold them himself. Beatrice and I became allies, almost friends, united by our love and care for this man who was fading before our eyes. In those final months, my father and I talked about everything. He told me stories from his life he had never shared. He talked to me about his regrets, about the things he wished he had done differently. He asked for my forgiveness for not being the father I deserved when I was a child, for being so absent after my mother died, for all the times he put work or his own pain before me. I also asked for his forgiveness for my resentment, for the years I spent judging him without trying to really understand him, for not having made more effort to connect with him before the crisis forced us to. I thanked him for that year we lived together, for finally showing me who he really was, for giving me the opportunity to know and love him for real before it was too late. We talked about my mother, about how much he missed her, about how her death had broken something in both of us that we never knew how to repair. He told me she would be proud of the woman I had become, of my strength, of my capacity to forgive, of my heart that remained capable of loving despite all the pain. My father died on a Tuesday morning in February, with Beatrice and me holding his hands, with the sun coming through his bedroom window illuminating his face. His last words were to tell me he loved me, that he had always loved me, that he had done the best he could with the emotional tools he had. I told him I knew, that I loved him too, that it was okay, that he could go in peace. After his death, Beatrice and I organized his funeral. It wasn't big or elaborate, just a small service with the few people who had known him well. On his tombstone we put simply his name, the dates of his life, and the phrase, "He did the best he could." Because that was true, for better or for worse. My father had done the best he could with what he had. Beatrice gave me all of my father's personal things, old photos, some letters he had written to my mother when they were dating, his watch that he had worn for decades. She also told me that my father had done something he never mentioned to me. He had taken out a modest life insurance policy months before he died, before he knew about the cancer, and had named me as the beneficiary. It wasn't much, about $30,000, but it was enough to give me a breather, to give me the opportunity to really start over. With that money, I was able to leave my room in the shared house and rent a small but decent apartment. I was able to take some online courses to update my professional skills. Eventually, I got a better job, not as good as the one I had before, but stable, with a reasonable salary and benefits. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to rebuild my life. 2 years have passed since my father died. My life now is different from what it was before all this started, but also different from what I imagined it would be. I'm still single, without children, living alone in my small apartment. But there is peace in my life now, a peace I didn't have before even when things were apparently going well. I understand now that my father loved me in the only way he knew how. He wasn't perfect, he made terrible mistakes, he hurt me deeply, but he also gave me something invaluable in that last year of his life, the opportunity to really know him, to see beyond his flaws and his emotional distance, to understand that he too was just a human being trying to navigate this difficult world with the limited tools life had given him. When he told me, "Pack your bags, daughter," I thought he was rejecting me, that he was choosing his own comfort over me. Now I understand that in his twisted, desperate mind, he thought he was freeing me, that he was giving me the opportunity to live without the burden of his death. He was wrong, of course. He took away my choice. He robbed us of months we could have had together. But his intentions, although executed in the most painful way possible, came from a place of love. I keep in touch with Beatrice. We see each other occasionally for coffee. We talk about my father. We share memories. She told me once that my father told her, a few weeks before he died, that his only true regret in life was not having been a better father to me, that if he could go back, he would have been more present, would have talked more, would have shown his love in ways I could understand, instead of assuming that providing financially was enough. I treasure those words. They don't erase the pain, they don't change the past, but they give me some peace. They remind me that in the end, my father saw me, valued me, loved me, even if he didn't always know how to show it. This story doesn't have a traditional happy ending. I didn't get my dream job. I didn't find the love of my life. I didn't become rich or famous. But I found something perhaps more valuable. I found forgiveness both for my father and for myself. I found understanding about the complexity of human relationships, about how love can exist alongside pain, about how people can hurt us deeply while trying to protect us. I learned that life isn't a straight line of progress, that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. I learned that family is complicated, that parents are human with their own traumas and fears, that love doesn't always look the way we think it should. And I learned that even when someone tells you pack your bags, even when you feel rejected and abandoned, sometimes there's a deeper, more complex, more painful story behind those words. Sometimes people push us away not because they don't love us, but because they love us too much and don't know how to handle that emotion along with their own pain. My father threw me out of his house. It's true, but he also gave me the final gift of allowing me to be there when it mattered most, of dying knowing I forgave him, that I loved him until the end, and that, despite all the pain along the way, is something for which I will be eternally grateful. If you are going through something similar, if someone you love has hurt you in ways you don't understand, I want you to know that it's okay to feel all the emotions you're feeling. It's okay to be angry, sad, confused. But I also encourage you to look for the deeper story, to try to understand the motivations behind the actions, even when those actions have caused you immense pain. That doesn't mean you have to forgive if you're not ready, but it means it's worth trying to see the full humanity of the people who hurt us. This is my truth. This is my story. And if I learned anything, it's that we are stronger than we believe, more capable of forgiving and loving than we think possible. And even though the path is painful, every loss carries within it the seed of something new.